Let me tell you about the strange comfort of terrible news. We live in an age where the world's pain is in our pocket. A feed that never sleeps. Bombs, floods, scandals, sickness, outrage, collapse. We are scrolling through a library of everything that's gone wrong. And we can't look away. You might even be doing it right now. The glow of the screen, the endless, downward flick of a thumb. A knot in your stomach, a tightness in your chest. And here's the question that echoes in the digital silence. Why? Why do we willingly, almost obsessively, consume the very information that makes us feel anxious, depressed, and powerless? It's easy to assume we're just trying to be informed, that we are responsible citizens doing our due diligence. But that's not the full picture. Beneath that simple excuse, there's an entire psychology at play. One that speaks volumes about our ancient wiring, our modern anxieties, and a quiet, desperate search for control in a world that feels like it's spinning off its axis. See, for some people, the scroll is not just information. It's a reflex. It's the brain's mistaken attempt to protect itself. Because whether we admit it or not, the algorithm has subtly reshaped how we see the world. It doesn't reward truth. It rewards reaction. It praises shock. It amplifies fear. And yet, those of us lost in the feed are often the ones trying to find the most clarity. We scroll past one tragedy, then another. We click before thinking. We react before processing. We judge before understanding. Psychologists have a name for our brain's ancient programming: negativity bias. For millennia, our survival didn't depend on remembering the beautiful sunset. It depended on remembering the shadow in the bushes, the sound of the predator, the taste of the poison. Our brains are not designed for happiness. They are designed for survival. And the feed, the algorithm, the 24-hour news cycle, they don't know the difference. They see this ancient bias and they feed it. They package threat, danger, and outrage into perfect, bite-sized units. And our brain says, pay attention. This is important for survival. In other words, you aren't trying to make yourself miserable. Your brain is trying to keep you safe. And in a world of constant, abstract, digital threats, that safety check never ends. Because let's be honest, most of what we're doing is not just reading. It's a form of reassurance seeking. It's an unconscious audition for safety. Every headline, every article, every shocking video says, here is a threat. Do you understand it? But when you can't stop scrolling, something shifts. You begin to tie your sense of safety to knowing every possible bad outcome. You stop thinking in terms of your own life. You start experiencing the collective anxiety of the entire world all at once. And that's the secret psychology behind doomscrolling. We crave control in a space where we have none. We don't hate the bad news. We're terrified of being surprised by it. It's not about being a pessimist or a cynic. It's about refusing to be caught off guard. Because when you've seen how fast the world can change, you start valuing the illusion of preparedness. Silence, to the doomscroller, feels like ignorance, and ignorance feels like danger. For some, the addiction to the scroll comes after a kind of informational burnout. Maybe they once did have healthy boundaries. Until one day, a crisis hit, a pandemic, an election, a war, and the need to know became all-consuming. They realized that every time they looked away, they felt an invisible pressure that they were failing, that they were irresponsible. They weren't living in the world anymore. They were monitoring it. So, they kept scrolling. No announcement, just a slow disappearance into the feed. But here's what's often misunderstood. Scrolling doesn't mean you're informed. It doesn't mean you're engaged. It often means you are stuck in a loop. A loop designed by the brightest minds in technology to hold your attention not for your benefit, but for theirs. There's a concept in psychology called intermittent reinforcement. It's the most powerful motivator for addiction. It's the principle that runs a slot machine. You don't get a reward every time. You get it randomly. You pull the lever, nothing, 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 jackpot, and your brain is flooded with dopamine. Doomscrolling is the same. It's a slot machine for information. We scroll past 10 articles that make us feel awful, bad news, outrage, despair, but we keep scrolling, unconsciously hoping for the 11th article. The one that will give us the answer. The one that says, it's over. The one that brings relief. We are not addicted to the bad news. We are addicted to the hunt for the good news, or at least for the final piece of the puzzle. We are pulling the lever again and again, hoping to finally feel safe, while poisoning ourselves in the process. So people who doomscroll are often guarding their sense of preparedness. They keep their moments filled with information, with noise, with data. And maybe that's not true awareness. Maybe it's a quiet kind of panic. Because think about it. When was the last time you went a full day without checking the news? When was the last time you felt a global crisis and didn't immediately feel the urge to refresh the feed? That reflex, that need to know, is not natural. It's conditioned. It's the product of a decade of algorithms training our brains to equate information with control. And when someone is trapped inside that system, it can feel like rebellion to look away. But it's also terrifying. They start rediscovering the anxiety of not knowing. Traveling without checking headlines. Cooking without the news on in the background. Feeling without a global context for their emotions. In that space, something awakens, a kind of anxiety that doesn't have an audience. But not everyone who doomscrolls is doing it from a place of fear. Some are driven by a distorted form of empathy. The constant awareness that you're witnessing suffering, even when you're not. And for many, that's exhausting. But it also feels necessary. They worry that to look away is a form of betrayal. That to be happy while others are suffering is a moral failing. So they scroll, not because they want to, but because the cost of their own peace feels too high. They want to be connected, but they are connecting to the trauma, not the people. And ironically, sometimes the people most addicted to the feed have the deepest desire for a better world. They're not absent. They're overflowing with a helpless compassion. They just choose the spectacle of the feed instead of the stillness of their own life. There's a deep philosophical undertone to that scroll. In a world that constantly says, look at this, choosing to look away feels like a form of negligence. It's saying, your pain doesn't matter to me. So they might scroll through others' tragedies nodding, aching, sometimes raging, but they rarely log off. Because they understand something most don't, that this information, this pain, is real for someone. And when you've lived through enough of those vicarious traumas, you start realizing that being informed is not the same as being helpful. It's actually where empathy is burned, not built. This is where the paradox lies. The feed was designed to connect us. Yet, it often leaves people feeling more isolated in their anxiety than ever. When you doomscroll, you stop chasing real-world solutions and start chasing digital validation for your outrage. You begin noticing who else is angry, without the need for real-world action. You learn who to blame, without reminders of shared humanity. That kind of connection, raw, algorithmic, feels heavier, colder, and infinitely less real. And the people who are stuck in the scroll, they live in that space. They build echo chambers that don't need proof. They find comfort in shared outrage, and they let life unfold while turning it into a catastrophe. Part of this is also about identity security, knowing who you are against. When you're comfortable in your own outrage, you don't need an audience to validate your worth. You just need the feed to validate your anger. That's not arrogance. It's a trap. And ironically, the same people who doom scroll often have the most interesting stories to tell about what they've read. But they save them for when you're sitting across the screen, not across the table. Because real connection to them isn't measured in shared silence. It's in shared panic, in eyes glued to a screen, in outrage that needs witnesses. These are the people who carry the world's weight within them, who process deeply, observe constantly, and understand quietly that it's all terrible. They don't need the world to applaud their awareness. They just need it to confirm their fears. And maybe, just maybe, in a world so desperate to be informed, their endless scrolling isn't a flaw. It's a mirror. A reminder that not everything that's trending is meaningful. That sometimes the most human thing you can do is to keep something, your own peace, entirely for yourself. You know what's fascinating? The longer someone stays off the feed, the more they begin to see the world differently. Their own problems look solvable. Time feels slower. Conversations feel fuller. It's as if stepping away from the noise makes everything real again. Because when you stop monitoring, you start experiencing. There's a quiet beauty in walking through life without needing proof of every distant disaster. You're not thinking about headlines or hot takes or captions. You're just there, fully alive, inside your own moment. Instead of outside, watching someone else's tragedy. And that's something the feed rarely lets us do anymore. But the psychology behind this goes deeper than preference or taste. It's rooted in how our brains process threat. Every time we post something online and it gets attention, our brain releases dopamine. But every time we see a threat, a shocking headline, an angry face, a warning, our brain releases cortisol, the stress hormone. Over time, we begin to crave that validation, or, in this case, we become acclimated to the cortisol. We start thinking in terms of solvable problems instead of overwhelming, abstract ones. We get used to a state of low-grade panic. Now, imagine someone who resists that loop. Someone who deliberately chooses to disconnect from the cortisol cycle. That's not disinterest. That's discipline. It takes self-awareness to resist something designed to keep you hooked on your own fear. People who don't doom scroll often have a strong internal locus of control. A psychological term meaning their sense of worth and happiness comes from within, from their own actions, not from external events. They don't need the digital echo of the world is ending to believe they should act. And here's what's even more interesting. Studies show that people who take long breaks from consuming 24-hour news content often experience a measurable decrease in anxiety and an increase in their sense of agency. Because when your sense of identity is no longer being constantly battered by global events, it becomes solid. It becomes real. You're no longer editing your life into something digestible for the outrage machine. You're living it in all its messy, beautiful, unfiltered complexity. And maybe that's the real rebellion, to stay whole in a world that rewards fragments. But silence from the feed doesn't always mean serenity. Sometimes it hides exhaustion. For many, the feed became a place where they once sought connection, but ended up feeling drained. There's a subtle emotional fatigue that comes from witnessing everyone's highlight reels. And a different, darker fatigue that comes from witnessing the world's low-light reel, while you're still trying to piece together your own life behind the scenes. You start comparing your small, personal problems to the world's great tragedies. You start questioning your worth, your right to be happy, even when you know better. And eventually, some people decide to step away, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. They realize they don't owe the world their mental health. They don't owe an explanation for their silence. And they don't need to keep proving they're aware just to be believed. That's one of the quiet truths of this generation. We've confused information with action. We assume that to matter, we must be noticed, or at least be in the know. But real meaning doesn't need witnesses. Some of the most meaningful moments of your life, the ones that shape who you are, will happen without a single person watching. No cameras, no captions, no audience, just you. And maybe that's what those who don't scroll understand best. They know that privacy is not ignorance. It's intimacy with yourself. Because when you stop broadcasting every thought and stop consuming every global tragedy, you start hearing your own thoughts again. You start reconnecting with the parts of you that got lost in the noise. Your quiet desires, your unspoken fears, your inner compass. And that's something profoundly spiritual in today's world. It's not a withdrawal. It's a homecoming. Of course, it's not always peaceful. There are moments of doubt, of wondering if silence makes you complicit, if you're falling behind while everyone else is performing their awareness. But with time, you start noticing something beautiful. Your worth doesn't disappear when nobody's looking. Your capacity for change doesn't disappear when you're not scrolling. It's still there, steady, like the hum of a quiet room after a storm. And maybe that's what real confidence looks like. Not the loud declaration of awareness online, but the calm assurance of agency offline. Some people say, if you're not informed, are you even engaged? But the truth is, the things that shape you most rarely make it to the feed. Your growth, your heartbreaks, your private victories, your quiet acts of kindness. They live in memory, not media. And maybe that's enough. When psychologists talk about authentic self-expression, they emphasize congruence, the alignment between who you are inside and who you show to the world. But in the age of the feed, that alignment is constantly distorted. You begin to live as a version of yourself curated for approval, or, in this case, curated by a steady diet of fear. So when someone chooses not to scroll, it might be their way of staying congruent, of preserving that fragile truth between their inner and outer world. They don't need everyone to see what they're feeling to validate that it's real. They don't need to consume every tragedy to remember how to be compassionate. They live their life fully and quietly. And here's the paradox. Those who live quietly, offline, often feel life most intensely. They're not distracted by the performance of it all. They absorb details others miss. The way light changes on a wall, the pause before someone speaks, the sound of distant laughter. They are present, and presence is the rarest currency in a world built on attention. But sometimes that very presence makes them misunderstood. People might label them as detached, ignorant, even cold. Yet, if you look closer, their silence isn't emptiness. It's depth. It's the calm that comes from no longer needing to explain yourself to be understood. There's a quiet confidence that comes from not needing to be informed by everyone, just understood by a few. And that's what the people who don't doom scroll understand best. They know that not every truth is meant for the crowd. That some parts of you, your peace, your focus, your energy, deserve to remain untouched by algorithms and opinions. Because once something becomes public, it stops being purely yours. And once you consume a public tragedy, it becomes part of you. It belongs to interpretation, to judgment, to trend. And maybe some moments and some parts of your mind are too sacred for that. So the next time you notice yourself caught in the scroll, don't assume you're just staying informed. Maybe you're just living. Maybe you're looking for peace in the quiet corners of existence. The ones not lit by the blue glow of a screen. Maybe you're the one who's remembered what the rest of us forgot. That being unseen doesn't mean being alone. That being quiet doesn't mean being empty. And that being uninformed of the latest disaster doesn't mean you don't care. That sometimes the truest expression of who you are is silence. Because in the end, we're not meant to be archives of tragedy. We're meant to be people. And the people who log off, they remind us of that every quiet, unfiltered, beautifully present moment.